Hi, I'm Chris Farnham. Welcome to the Australian Institute of International Affairs, and joining us today to talk about the terrorist threat in Southeast Asia and Indonesia is the Director of the Institute for Policy Analysis of Conflict, Ms. Sydney Jones. Thanks very much for joining us today.
Happy to be here.
If I could start by asking you to describe what the current landscape looks like in regards to the terror threat in Southeast Asia and particularly Indonesia.
I think we're unfortunately seeing more activity than we've seen in a decade. And I think it has to do with the many groups that are interested in going to Syria, the competition among those groups, both among different leaders in Syria as well as among different groups in Indonesia, and the interest in following through on what they see as ISIS orders to attack, including attacking foreigners.
Right, as we've seen, the recent attacks in Jakarta have shown that the threat is very real. And in a recent IPAC paper, you've mentioned that there has been a fragmentation of the Southeast Asian groups operating in Syria, and that this may create an increased threat for attacks as they compete for prominence. Could you explain why smaller groups create a greater risk than maybe one centrally organised, controlled and well-funded group in Indonesia and Southeast Asia?
I think what we've seen is that if you only have one large, well-organized group, as Jemaah Islamiyah was in the past, it's easier for a government to actually detect different parts of it and crack down on the leadership in a way that can damage the group as a whole. So I think the conclusion of many groups, not just in Indonesia, is that it's actually better to have many autonomous cells working toward the same goal because it's more secure that way. But even beyond that, we now have this competition taking place where it's clear that the individuals in Syria want to be seen by the ISIS leadership as the individuals that can actually carry out attacks at home and who can mobilize supporters to do this. So for each of the individuals competing for leadership, they have tried to identify religious leaders that they can work with in Indonesia, operational leaders that they can work with, organizations that have some kind of mass base, Pesantrens, that is Islamic boarding schools, or mosques that can serve as a kind of headquarters, some link to prisons because so many of the convicted terrorists in prison have experience that's critical to undertaking action, and many of them have links either to the former conflict areas of Poso or Ambon, where we had communal conflicts in the past, and where people gathered combat experience, or in some cases to Mindanao in the southern Philippines. So if you look at each individual set of linkages like this and understand that they're all competing to do attacks bigger and better than the one before, you understand the burden that the police have to try and interdict these. Fortunately, so far, most of them are incompetent. But our concern is that with people coming back from Syria and with some of the expansion that we're seeing of the networks, that this could change.
And this isn't the first time that Indonesia and Southeast Asia has experienced returning fighters. In the 1990s, there were jihadis returning from the conflict zone in Afghanistan. Are we facing a similar dynamic today, or are there unique challenges to returning fighters or the threat emanating out of the Middle East?
I think it's very interesting that there are so many comparisons made between the return of foreign fighters from Afghanistan and the potential for return from Syria, because the situations, in fact, are very different. When Indonesians went to Afghanistan, and there were about 300, under 300 in total, that went to train there, they wanted to get the skills to return home and fight the Suharto government. They were fighting repression at home. That's what pushed them out. In Syria, no one is going because of grievances or injustice or poverty, or there are no push factors. They're all pull factors, people going there because they want to fight or they want to live in a caliphate or under a state that's applying Islamic law in full. And they're not just going on their own, they're going with their families in many cases. So we're seeing people that have a commitment to staying. They don't want to return home. However, we think there is a likelihood, if the Islamic State disintegrates, that many of them will come back, and that's going to be a major problem for the Indonesian government.
You mentioned the existing conflicts in places like Poso and also in the region. What is it that makes these fighters and their families move all the way to the Middle East to take up the fight or to exist in a caliphate when they have their own fight existing in their own country?
I think there's several factors, and I think they've changed somewhat over time. But I think in 2013, the pull to Syria was in part to defend Muslims under attack, because the atrocities of the Assad regime were being played up as an evil Shia massacring Sunnis, and it was the duty of all Muslims to go to the aid of the Sunnis. There were the end of time prophecies that the great war at the end of the world between good and evil, in which Islam would triumph, would take place in Greater Syria, or Sham as they called it. And many Indonesians, and actually Muslims from many other parts of the world, were very attracted by these prophecies and wanted to be there for the final battle. After the caliphate was announced, you began to see more families going over because of propaganda that was aimed at families, that it was important to bring up your children in a fully Islamic environment, and that this was a state that could provide both a normal life, in some cases free housing, medical care, and schooling, but also where Islamic law was applied in full.
So what are the takeaways for Australian policymakers when considering the threat from the region and also for the region, and how best can they work with their regional counterparts to reduce the terror threat?
I think in many ways it's to keep on doing what they're doing already. The Australian police have a very close relationship, for example, with the counterterrorism unit of the Indonesian police. And I think that cooperation has worked very well in a very low-profile kind of way. There has been assistance in the past offered by the Australian government to the prison system, which God knows needs improvement. It's a huge, weak link that's enabled terrorist networks to flourish. Unfortunately, it was unwillingness on the Indonesian side to actually take some of that assistance and use it effectively that made the program in the end unworkable. I think the Australian government is still interested in helping the Indonesians manage their prison systems better and to identify high-risk offenders and do better post-release monitoring and so on. And all that would be enormously helpful. But they've run into many obstacles on the Indonesian side. So until those obstacles can be addressed, more aid is not necessarily going to make a difference in that area. There's also a lot of assistance that the Australians are doing to help the Islamic school system, and that's fantastically useful. It's more a long-term initiative, and will have payoffs more in the long term than in the short term. But I think there are people-to-people exchanges that can, in the long term, reduce the idea of foreigners as the enemy.
You mentioned the prison system, and this has been highlighted as one of the major problems, and also it's quite topical with Abu Bakr Bashir just recently being moved in the prison system as well because of complaints that he's made about his treatment. What was the unwillingness in Indonesia to make that change, and is it a mixture of unwillingness and inability, or is there a distinct refusal to make the changes required to reduce the threat coming from the prison system?
The problems are so vast, it's almost hard to know where to begin to answer that question. First of all, it's corruption throughout the system, which makes it possible not only to pay off guards, to, for example, use cell phones anytime you want, but even to smuggle in people to have discussions overnight in the prisons. Now, this is stopped, as far as I know, in recent months, but less than 6 months ago, one prisoner was able to smuggle in his wife for 3 days, and it was only after someone reported to the prison authorities that she was escorted out. There isn't sufficient searching of visitors, nor is there sufficient analysis of the patterns of visits that take place. Because one of the things we've seen is for the pro-ISIS groups, it becomes obligatory to pay at least one visit a month to either Abu Bakr Bashir or to the other more important cleric who's detained or in the same prison complex, or the same prison complex until Bashir was just transferred. But his name is Aman Abdurrahman. He's a more important ideologue, and it's his followers that are the core of the pro-ISIS groups in Indonesia. Regular visits to him are one mechanism that keeps the ISIS network together as a unit.
You would think that this would offer a fantastic surveillance opportunity for the Indonesian authorities to be able to map out the system. Clearly there are great complexities, and we really appreciate your insights into this. Thank you very much for coming to speak to us.
Thank you.
And thank you.